How lumberjacks built bunkhouses to survive. Frozen forest camps. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the sound of cracking ice, the smell of pine resin, and the rhythmic groan of timber falling in deep winter forests. So, if you've settled in, maybe you've turned off the lights, your blankets wrapped just right, and your phone's at that almost too dim level. Let's take a quiet walk into the past, into a place that was cold, loud, and full of men who could fell a tree before breakfast, but somehow couldn't build a roof that didn't leak. We're talking about lumberjacks. Not the flannel-shirted, hipster coffee-drinking kind that haunt modern cities, but the real ones, the men who lived, worked, and froze their way through the northern forests of the 19th century. This isn't the romantic, Paul Bunyan version of history. No blue ox, no heroic singing, just the slow, exhausting grind of life in the logging camps, where comfort was optional, frostbite was likely, and survival depended on your ability to stay warm, sober, and mostly upright. So tonight, let's drift quietly into the bunkhouses of those long-forgotten winters, where the air was thick with sawdust, the food was questionable, and everyone snored like they were trying to outdo the wind itself. Life in the frozen frontier. The lumberjacks' world began long before dawn, in the northern forests of North America. Maine, Michigan, Ontario, Quebec. Winter wasn't just a season, it was the only time work really happened. In summer, the ground was too soft to haul logs. The rivers were unpredictable, the mosquitoes unbearable. But in winter, when the earth froze solid and the snow packed down like ice, logs could be dragged by horse or oxen across the slick paths. That's when the lumberjacks came in, whole crews of them, trudging through snow that swallowed their boots, carrying axes so sharp they could split a hair. They lived in camps deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, for months at a time. And while the work was hard, the living conditions were arguably harder. Their home was the bunkhouse, a long, low, smoky building where anywhere from 20 to 60 men might sleep shoulder to shoulder, sharing warmth, stories, and occasionally, lice. It was built quickly because time was money, and comfort didn't earn profits. The bosses cared about production, not amenities. So, the lumberjacks did what they always did. They made do. Building the bunkhouse, imagine the scene. It's early winter, maybe late November. A team of loggers has arrived in a clearing beside a frozen river. They unpack their axes, sleds, and a few shovels, and immediately begin building their temporary home. There was no blueprint, no architect, just the same rough design passed down from camp to camp. A long rectangle, maybe 40 feet by 20, made of thick pine logs notched together at the corners. The logs were rough-hewn, sometimes still sticky with sap. The walls were chinked with moss or mud to keep out the wind, though "keep out" was a generous phrase. You could always count on a draft. Somewhere, the roof was usually covered with split cedar or spruce bark, layered thickly enough to shed snow. It worked for the most part, until the snow got too heavy. and you found yourself brushing flakes off your blanket in the middle of the night. The door was basic, a single plank swinging on wooden pegs, and it usually didn't close quite right. But that was fine. Ventilation was important, because the inside of a bunkhouse had one defining feature: the stove. The stove and the smoke. At the heart of every bunkhouse was a massive iron or sheet metal stove. It was both the pride and the curse of the camp. Built big enough to hold a tree trunk if needed, it burned day and night, eating through cords of wood faster than the men could cut them. It was the only source of heat, and it was fiercely uneven. If you slept near it, you roasted. If you were unlucky enough to be at the far end of the room, you froze, and everyone in between choked on the smoke. Because while these stoves were large, they weren't particularly well designed. They often belched out more smoke than warmth, and the chimneys leaked constantly. Within minutes of lighting it, the whole bunkhouse filled with a gray, eye-watering haze. It was said that you could tell a lumberjack by his cough, deep, rasping, and punctuated by a laugh that sounded like it came from inside a whiskey barrel. Still, the stove was sacred. It was the center of the room, the center of life. Men gathered around it to dry their socks, thaw their boots, and toast bits of salt pork on the end of sticks. And at night, as the fire dimmed to a dull orange, they'd stare into it, silent, exhausted, thinking about home or food or nothing at all, sleeping arrangements or the lack thereof. Now, you might imagine bunk beds, perhaps even straw mattresses, and to be fair, sometimes those existed, but more often, they didn't. The earliest lumber camps had what was called a bunk crib, a long wooden platform running down each side of the room, raised a few feet off the ground. Men slept in rows, shoulder to shoulder, sometimes 4 or 5 deep, with no separation at all. Their mattresses were stuffed with hay or balsam boughs, soft at first, but by week 2, compressed into a lumpy mat full of needles. Blankets were scarce, so most men slept in their clothes, sometimes even with their boots on. Body heat was the only reliable insulation. It was crowded, smelly, and remarkably efficient. You didn't need an alarm clock when 40 men woke up sneezing at the same time, and yet there was a strange kind of comfort in it. The snoring, the wheezing, the occasional murmur. It became a rhythm, a background hum that told you you weren't alone in the frozen wilderness. The smell of the place. Let's talk about the smell. Because the lumber camp was fragrant. Picture a mix of sweat, smoke, pine sap, wet wool, and unwashed humanity. Bathing was rare. There was no running water, and ice had to be chopped from nearby rivers and melted in iron pots. So, cleanliness was theoretical. Clothes were worn until they could practically stand on their own. Boots never fully dried. And socks, well, socks were personal property in a way words can't describe. Add to that the ever-present odor of wet dogs, because sometimes there were actual dogs, and the faint scent of stew that had been cooking for 3 days. And you have the authentic aroma of the 19th century logging life. Visitors sometimes described entering a bunkhouse as walking into a wall of damp men. which sounds poetic, but probably wasn't. Dinner-time meals in the lumber camps were a matter of practicality. The cook, often the most respected man in camp, after the foreman, was in charge of feeding dozens of ravenous workers 3 times a day. Breakfast came early, usually before sunrise. It might include pancakes, salt pork, beans, and gallons of coffee so strong it could wake the dead. Or at least the half-frozen. Dinner, or lunch, was eaten in the woods. Cold bread, salt meat, and maybe pie if you were lucky. Supper back in camp was hearty, if repetitive. Stew, beans, and more bread. Dessert, when it existed, was usually dried fruit boiled into submission. Still, for men burning thousands of calories a day swinging axes, quantity mattered more than variety. They didn't need flavor. They needed fuel. And in that, the cooks delivered. A good camp cook could make or break morale. A bad one risked mutiny. The evening routine, after a long day of felling, hauling, and swearing at the cold, the lumberjacks would trudge back to camp at sunset. The forest would fall quiet, except for the crunch of boots and the low hum of voices. Inside the bunkhouse, wet clothes were hung near the stove, filling the air with the heavy scent of steam and smoke. Men would eat, smoke their pipes, maybe tell stories or play cards by candlelight. Someone might hum a song. Not well, but earnestly. There was laughter sometimes, or a few grumbles about the foreman, or quiet talk of wages and debts. But more often, there was silence, a kind of exhausted stillness that settled in like fog. And then, one by one, the men would crawl into their bunks, boots and all, pulling rough blankets over their shoulders. The fire would burn low, the stove would creak, and the snores would rise like a storm. Outside, the wind would whisper through the pines, and snow would drift down quietly, sealing the world in white. The tools of the trade. Every lumberjack owned a few essentials: his axe, his boots, and his pride. The axe was sharpened daily, polished, oiled, and treated with more respect than most people treated each other. It was personal, almost sacred. A dull blade wasn't just inefficient, it was dangerous. The boots were hobnailed and heavy, often lined with wool. They were meant to grip ice, mud, and bark, though they still slipped frequently, leading to more than a few unfortunate tumbles. And then there was the saw. The crosscut saw, handled by 2 men working in rhythm, could slice through a tree several feet thick in minutes. When sharpened properly, it sang, a long, drawn-out metallic hum that echoed through the forest. For many lumberjacks, that sound, that steady, patient sawing, was the song of their lives. A night in the camp. If you could walk into a 19th century bunkhouse on a winter night, here's what you'd see. The stove glows faintly, surrounded by boots, socks, and bits of steaming clothing. Men lie sprawled on wooden bunks, some half covered in blankets, others too tired to bother. A few talk quietly, their voices low and heavy with exhaustion. One man snores so loudly the others throw straw at him. Outside, the snow keeps falling. The wind rattles the roof, and somewhere in the darkness, a tree groans under its own frozen weight before cracking with a sound like thunder. What happened to the eunuchs? After the empires fell, the last voice in the palace tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of history, though not a very comfortable one. If you've ever wondered what happened to the people who made empires run, the ones behind the silk curtains, behind the emperors, behind the stories, then this one's for you. Because tonight, we're talking about the eunuchs. Now, eunuchs are one of those topics that history sort of mumbles about. They appear suddenly, whispering in the background of Byzantine mosaics, advising emperors in Chinese courts, or carrying messages in Ottoman palaces. And then, just as suddenly, they vanish, like the lights going out in a long hallway. But what actually happened to them? When the empires they served collapsed, when the palaces emptied, and the marble floors cooled, and all the power they'd balanced for centuries just dissolved. What became of the men who were no longer quite men, yet had lived closer to kings than anyone else? Let's find out. It's hard to talk about eunuchs without first acknowledging the obvious, the job requirement. Throughout much of imperial history, eunuchs were the people who had been deliberately castrated, usually as boys, often to make them safe around royal women, or, more importantly, to make them loyal to the throne. A man with no heirs, after all, was supposedly a man with no divided loyalties. The logic was elegant, horrifying, but elegant. Across civilizations, this same grim calculus reappeared. In ancient China, where court eunuchs managed everything from silk storage to imperial secrets. In Byzantium, where they became generals, chancellors, and, occasionally, saints. And in the Ottoman Empire, where the harem and treasury alike were staffed by men whose entire lives were built on the condition of their own bodily absence. Of course, no one planned to become a eunuch. For most, it wasn't a career path so much as a sentence. But history has a strange sense of irony. Many eunuchs, denied a family, found power instead. They became confidants, spies, brokers of the unspoken. And then, when the empires fell, when the emperors fled, or the caliphs died, or the palaces turned into museums, those same men were left with nothing but silence. So, tonight we'll drift gently through that silence. We'll visit the ghostly afterlives of the eunuchs who outlived their empires, from the Edirne, Byzantines, and the Ottomans to the last imperial courts of China, and see what happened when the music stopped and the doors finally closed. Let's start with Byzantium, because Byzantines loved eunuchs almost as much as they loved theological arguments. In Constantinople, eunuchs weren't just servants. They were an entire social class. They ran the palace bureaucracy, commanded armies, and occasionally rose higher than any whole man could. One of the empire's most powerful generals, Narcissus, was a eunuch. He led armies into Italy in the 6th century, and, somewhat unfortunately, was said to be very good at it. He was also reportedly 80 years old when he went to war, which feels like the most Byzantine possible decision. Let's send the elderly eunuch to invade Italy. What could go wrong? But the Byzantine system actually made sense in its own peculiar way. Eunuchs couldn't establish dynasties, which made them politically safe. A eunuch general couldn't hand his command to his son, because, well, there wasn't one. So emperors trusted them with dangerous power. Power that, theoretically, would die with them. By the Middle Ages, eunuchs were everywhere in Constantinople. They guarded relics. They sang in choirs. They handled imperial correspondence. Some became bishops. A few even became saints. Because, in a world obsessed with celibacy, a eunuch was essentially born pre-qualified. But when Constantinople fell in 1453, the Byzantine eunuchs faced a peculiar extinction. The Ottomans, who conquered the city, had their own eunuchs, imported largely from Africa or the Caucasus. And they didn't need the pale, Greek-speaking versions. A few Byzantine eunuchs tried to adapt. Some entered Ottoman service as scribes or translators. Others vanished into monasteries, where their unusual condition made them curiosities of faith, living symbols of chastity, and occasionally of divine punishment. A handful survived long enough to see the Hagia Sophia turned into a mosque. Imagine that for a moment, spending your entire life serving a divine empire, only to hear the call to prayer echo through the same marble halls. History rarely grants closure. It just changes the locks. Over in China, though, the eunuchs lingered longer, much longer. The Chinese imperial court had been employing eunuchs since at least the Zhou dynasty, which means, roughly, forever. By the Ming dynasty, in the 15th century, the Forbidden City was practically a city of eunuchs. They managed the imperial workshops, the kitchens, the libraries, the post, and, of course, the harem. The emperor might have been the son of heaven, but his messengers, his secretaries, and his eyes were all eunuchs. Some were loyal, some were terrifying. And then there was Zheng He, possibly the most famous eunuch in history. Born in the 14th century, Zheng He was captured as a boy, castrated, and sent into palace service. Somehow, through competence, luck, and the emperor's favor, he became the admiral of the largest fleet on earth. He led 7 voyages across the Indian Ocean, commanding hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. It's one of those quietly mind-bending historical facts that the man who expanded China's influence across half the known world couldn't technically reproduce. But power in the palace was a double-edged fan. Later, emperors came to fear the eunuch's growing influence. Corruption scandals erupted. Ministers accused eunuchs of controlling the throne, and purges became common. By the 19th century, the once glorious court eunuchs had become figures of ridicule, half feared, half pitied. When the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1912 and the emperor abdicated, thousands of eunuchs were suddenly unemployed. And here's where the story gets strange. Many of these men had been born in the palace. They didn't know any other world. When the Forbidden City became a museum, they stayed. Not as servants, but as squatters. They slept in side halls, sweeping the floors or guiding tourists, hoping the new republic would forget to notice them. The last of them, A man named Sun Yaoting lived until 1996. He had been castrated at the age of 8 under the Qing dynasty and had served the last emperor, Puyi, before becoming a sort of living relic himself. A frail reminder of a world that had once believed human mutilation was a reasonable staffing policy. Sun was interviewed late in life, and his recollections are haunting in their simplicity. He said he didn't remember pain, only confusion. And when asked what he thought of the old system, he just said, "It was the way things were." There's something almost unbearably calm about that. A man who'd lived through the end of empire, communism, modernization, and television, and still regarded his own loss as an administrative detail. Meanwhile, back in the Ottoman world, eunuchs didn't fade so quietly. The empire's harem and palace bureaucracy had been run for centuries by African eunuchs, many of them brought through the slave routes from Sudan, Ethiopia, or the Horn of Africa. The most powerful among them held the title of Kızlar Aga, Chief of the Girls, which sounds quaint until you realize he effectively controlled access to the Sultan himself. The Kızlar Aga managed the imperial harem, the treasury, and the sacred endowments in Mecca and Medina. He was, in many ways, the empire's shadow vizier, the man who could whisper through the curtains and decide who lived or died. But when the Ottoman Empire finally dissolved after World War I, these eunuchs found themselves stranded in a world that no longer had palaces, harems, or need for their services. Some converted their connections into wealth. Others drifted into religious work, serving in mosques or running endowments, but most simply disappeared, their stories swallowed by the polite silence of the new Turkish Republic, which preferred to forget that the empire had ever needed such people. One Western traveler in the 1920s described seeing an elderly black eunuch sitting outside the Topkapi Palace gates, dressed in immaculate old robes, as if waiting for an empire that had forgotten to open the door. It's hard to imagine a more melancholy image. A man who had once guarded the Sultan's most private chambers, now waiting on the wrong side of the wall. By the 20th century, eunuchs had vanished almost completely. Their roles had been replaced by bureaucrats, secretaries, and civil servants, people whose loyalty could now be ensured by contracts instead of anatomy. But for nearly 3,000 years, eunuchs had been the glue of empires, the quiet middlemen between power and intimacy, between ruler and ruled. And when those empires fell, it was the eunuchs who were left with no place to stand. They were too specialized to adapt, too marked by their roles to start over. Many died poor. Many died alone. Let's drift forward a little now, into the era when the last eunuchs still walked among us, as living ghosts of imperial power. Because, believe it or not, there were still a few left in the 20th century. In China, in Vietnam, and even in parts of the Middle East, men who had been surgically frozen in time by systems that no longer existed. In the next part, we'll follow some of them, the ones who tried to adjust to modern life after centuries of ritual servitude, and we'll see how the last eunuchs became the last witnesses to their vanished worlds. What happened to medieval nuns who tried to escape the convent? Tonight we're drifting back to a world of incense, candlelight, and very heavy doors that lock from the outside. You can get comfortable now. Maybe dim the lights, because tonight's story is about people who were supposed to stay put forever, and what happened when they didn't. We're talking about medieval nuns, and not the cheerful, singing kind that modern pop culture likes to hand us. These were women sent into cloisters for reasons that were, more often than not, financial, political, or just inconvenient to their families. And when some of them decided they'd rather not, the consequences were complicated. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, a convent wasn't just a spiritual retreat. It was also a very efficient solution for families who had too many daughters. Marriage required dowries, expensive ones, and the church offered a discounted alternative: send your daughter to God instead. It was considered respectable, pious, and delightfully economical. Once you handed over a modest donation, your daughter was tucked away behind cloister walls, where she could neither marry, inherit, nor cause scandals. In return, you got the comforting illusion that she was spending her life praying for your soul's salvation. Of course, not everyone who entered a convent was a reluctant captive. Some women genuinely sought it out. A medieval convent could be an oasis, a place to read, write, manage estates, or avoid childbirth, which, statistically, was about as safe as juggling torches in a hayloft. But for others, especially noble daughters who had been bundled off at 14, the cloister wasn't a sanctuary, it was a very elegant prison with embroidery lessons. Let's drift to England, sometime around the 13th century. A young woman named Joan de Killingworth had been placed in a convent by her family. She didn't want to stay, and one morning, she simply left. It sounds simple, but leaving a convent was a theological crisis. You weren't just breaking your vows, you were breaking your marriage to Christ. And in the eyes of medieval church law, that made you a sort of divine adulteress. When Joan left, her bishop reacted as though she'd robbed a cathedral. Letters were sent out. Other religious houses were warned to watch for her. The penalty was excommunication, spiritual death, and in a society where heaven was the only exit plan worth having. That was a terrifying sentence. Still, plenty of nuns took their chances. Records from across Europe, especially England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, are filled with stories of women who fled. Sometimes it was out of love, sometimes out of desperation, and sometimes, well, just because they'd had enough. Take the case of Sister Cecily Champagne, an English nun who, around 1318, simply refused to come back when her abbess summoned her. The bishop's letters are exasperated. They describe her as wandering about in secular habit, which is medieval clerical code for she's wearing normal clothes and we're furious about it. She wasn't alone. There were networks, informal ones, of sympathizers who helped runaway nuns find work or hide. Innkeepers, distant relatives, the occasional kind-hearted parish priest. Because everyone knew that once you crossed the convent wall, you couldn't exactly walk into the nearest village and say, "Hello, I've just divorced Jesus. Do you have any openings?" Of course, Most runaways didn't get very far. Convents were enclosed communities, but they were also under surveillance. Local clergy, nobles, and even sheriffs were expected to report any woman who seemed out of place. You can imagine how well that went in towns where gossip traveled faster than the plague. When captured, runaway nuns were usually brought back in a mix of shame and ceremony. Some bishops staged public penances. The women would be led through the church in sackcloth, barefoot, sometimes with ashes sprinkled in their hair. It was equal parts ritual humiliation and deterrent theater. Others were quietly forgiven after promising to behave, because, after all, convents relied on reputation. Too many scandalous escapes, and donors might start to wonder what exactly was going on behind the cloister gate. Let's take a gentler moment here, because not every escape was a story of rebellion. Some were, quite literally, survival. In 15th century Germany, a nun named Katharina von Bora lived in the convent of Nimschen. She'd been sent there as a child, barely 6 years old. By her 20s, she'd grown disillusioned. The convent was strict, cold, and isolated. And then she heard whispers about a monk named Martin Luther, a man who had written daring things about freedom of faith. With the help of a friendly merchant, she and 11 other nuns smuggled themselves out in empty fish barrels. Yes, fish barrels. It was not a glamorous getaway, but it worked. Luther found them homes, arranged marriages, and in Katharina's case, married her himself. She became one of the most famous escaped nuns in history. Though Luther later admitted that when she proposed to him, he wasn't exactly enthusiastic at first, which, to be fair, is not the most romantic start to a marriage. But not everyone had a reformer waiting with open arms. In France, a woman named Jeanne de Mondeville escaped her convent in 1368 and vanished for years, living disguised as a servant. When she was caught, the court records note that she appeared to have forgotten all her Latin, a deliberate tactic, maybe to appear simple, or perhaps she'd simply stopped using it. Either way, she was returned to her abbey. Her rebellion noted, her name recorded for eternity as the disobedient one. The archives are full of these fragments, little human moments buried in ecclesiastical paperwork. One bishop complains that a nun has been keeping company with a young man of no virtue. Another laments that his convents have become dens of idle chatter. And in between the lines, you can almost hear it. The restless rustle of lives that wanted something more than obedience. We like to think of convents as silent places, but they were noisy. They were full of music, chanting, gossip, domestic quarrels, and the clatter of daily chores. In some larger houses, dozens of women lived together for decades. Some became abbesses, administrators who managed land, finances, and servants. Others never adjusted. There's one English letter from the 14th century, written by a nun who begged to leave because she was tormented by the noise of the younger sisters. The bishop denied her. It's not exactly a grand rebellion, but it's wonderfully human. Proof that even in the Middle Ages, the sound of teenagers talking too loudly was unbearable. Of course, the church had its reasons for strict control. Nuns weren't just women. They were consecrated property. Their bodies, technically, belonged to the divine. If one escaped, it wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was theft from heaven. And for bishops, theft was paperwork. Lots of it, still. There's something strangely comforting about these stories. They're reminders that even in a world built on obedience, people pushed back, gently, clumsily, sometimes disastrously, but always humanly. Let's drift a little further, toward the daily life they were escaping from. Because to understand why a nun might risk excommunication, it helps to know what life inside was really like. A typical day began before dawn. The bell rang in the dark, sometimes at 2 or 3 a.m., summoning the sisters to matins. Cold stone underfoot, candles flickering, the same psalms every day. Then came lauds, breakfast, usually bread and beer, then work, copying manuscripts, tending gardens, weaving, or teaching girls from noble families. There was a short break for the midday meal, then more prayers, more work, and eventually, Compline, the final service before bed. Silence descended. No talking until morning. Just the creak of wooden floors and the sound of someone quietly regretting their life choices. It wasn't all bleak, though some convents were lively. Even influential abbesses managed estates that rivaled small kingdoms. The abbess of Fontevraud, for example, ruled over both monks and nuns, an arrangement that scandalized male clergy for centuries. Others became centers of learning. Hildegard of Bingen, mystic, composer, herbalist, wrote entire treatises while technically confined. But Hildegard was exceptional. Most convents were closer to rural dormitories than universities, and for every Hildegard, there were dozens of anonymous women stitching altar cloths and wondering what would have happened if they'd said no a little louder. And that brings us back to the question, what actually happened to the ones who tried to leave? Most were recaptured. Some disappeared into towns and villages, remade their lives, and were never found. A few were punished severely. Imprisonment, public penance, even flogging. But the majority simply faded from record. In a way, that's the most peaceful ending possible, because the Church only documented failure. If you vanished successfully, you stopped existing in official memory, which, ironically, might have been the closest thing to freedom they could get. Let's stop here, gently, at that quiet thought. The kind of escape that leaves no trace. In the next part, we'll drift further into the 14th and 15th centuries, where the Church began tightening its grip, and the drama of runaway nuns took some surprisingly bureaucratic turns. For now, just imagine it. The convent after dark, candles out, and one small, silent figure slipping through the cloister gate, holding her breath beneath the moonlight, halfway between sin and salvation. What did people really smell like in the Middle Ages? The myth of the unwashed past. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world before deodorant, before toothpaste, before the concept of personal space had really settled in. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, take a slow breath, and prepare to find out what medieval people actually smelled like, which, to be clear, was not quite the cartoonish cloud of filth that modern movies would have you believe. No, the truth is far stranger and much more fragrant. Let's start by addressing the myth that everyone in the Middle Ages was caked in dirt, wading through sewage, blissfully unaware of soap. It's the sort of comforting superiority we like to give ourselves. Because, of course, it's easier to feel evolved when you imagine your ancestors living in a perpetual cloud of body odor. But that image, the unwashed medieval peasant, is a Victorian invention. It came from the 19th century, when modern hygiene was just beginning to take shape, and historians wanted to paint the past as a barbaric before picture. They were very fond of before and after stories. In reality, medieval people cared deeply about cleanliness. They just defined it differently. For starters, yes, they bathed. Quite a lot, actually. Public bathhouses existed in most major European towns. In Paris alone, there were dozens. In London, they were called stews, not because of the smell, but because they were often built near the Thames, where the water stewed gently in the summer sun. Men and women bathed separately, though that rule was, let's say, flexible. Bathing was a social event. There were candles, herbs, sometimes even food and wine. It was less hygienic maintenance and more spa day with strangers. And medieval people loved to scent the water. Rose petals, thyme, lavender, marjoram. If you were wealthy, you might even add imported spices like cinnamon or cloves, because smelling expensive was half the point. Now, it's true that not everyone had easy access to these luxuries. Peasants couldn't exactly draw a rose-scented bath whenever they pleased, but even they washed. In rivers, ponds, or with buckets of water heated over a fire. They scrubbed themselves with rough linen cloths and soap made from animal fat and ash. Not exactly lush brand quality, but serviceable. Cleanliness, for them, wasn't about germs. Germ theory wouldn't arrive until the 19th century. It was about moral purity. To be clean was to be respectable, godly, and socially acceptable. There are sermons from the 13th century warning people not to come to church smelling bad, because it was considered an insult to the divine, not to mention the other parishioners. But while medieval people liked to be clean, they also liked to smell like something, and that something was usually strong. Let's drift for a moment into the world of medieval perfume, because this is where things get both elegant and weird. Perfume wasn't just for nobles, though they certainly led the trend. Scents were everywhere, sewn into clothes, sprinkled on floors, burned in rooms, and even tucked into pillows. People carried little pomanders, small metal balls filled with herbs or spices, to ward off unpleasant odors and, theoretically, disease. Remember, they thought bad smells caused sickness. So walking around with a scented ball of cloves was basically early medieval medicine. Some pomanders were incredibly ornate. Silver filigree, little compartments for different ingredients. Others were just chunks of ambergris or musk tied in cloth, which, if you've never encountered them, both smell like someone left a candle burning in a leather shop for a week. royal households took scent to architectural extremes. The French court in particular had a passion for perfumed everything. Rooms were fumigated with herbs. Gloves were soaked in aromatic oils. Even pets were perfumed, because apparently, if your lapdog didn't smell like imported civet, you were practically a beggar. The Queen of Hungary, Elizabeth of Poland, is credited with commissioning one of the earliest recorded perfumes in Europe around the 14th century. It was called Hungary Water, and it was a blend of rosemary and alcohol. Simple, sharp, and so popular that people kept using it for centuries. It's still made today, though mercifully with fewer alchemical overtones. So no, the medieval elite did not smell like rot. They smelled like herbs, vinegar, resin, and occasionally desperation. That said, medieval towns themselves did smell challenging. Picture narrow streets, open drains, livestock wandering freely, and a general lack of enthusiasm for municipal sanitation. Chamber. Pots were emptied into the street. Tanners worked with rotting animal hides and urine, and fish markets were not known for subtlety. It wasn't that medieval people were unaware of the stench. They just lived with it. Smells were part of life, like weather. There's a wonderful letter from 14th century Paris complaining that the air outside a tanner's workshop was so strong it makes the angels weep. And yet, the workshop stayed open. You couldn't escape the smells of life or death in a medieval town. So, people, compensated by cultivating small islands of scent, a sprig of rosemary tucked into the sleeve, a sachet of mint or violet petals hidden in a chest, tiny acts of olfactory, rebellion against the tide of urban decay. Now, let's drift into a different kind of smell. The body itself. What did people smell like? Well, it depended entirely on who you were, what you ate, and how close you stood. Medieval diets were heavy on meat, onions, and garlic, especially for the poor. The wealthy indulged in game, cheese, and plenty of wine. And without toothpaste, everyone's breath was, let's say, robust. But contrary to what you might imagine, body odor wasn't seen as shameful, it was just human. People commented on it, but rarely as an insult. There are love poems describing the smell of a lover's skin, hair, or even sweat, in oddly affectionate terms. Apparently, the natural musk of the beloved was seen as part of their charm, which is, admittedly, a bold stance when you're living in a world with no mouthwash. Still, there were limits. Medieval etiquette books are full of advice on personal scent management. Don't come to dinner dirty. Don't breathe heavily in someone's face. And, my favorite, from a 14th century guide to manners. If your armpits offend, wash them with vinegar and sage, for the company will not thank you. Practical, timeless. Vinegar, by the way, was the medieval deodorant of choice. It cut through grease, killed odor, and made you smell faintly like pickles, which, in context, was probably an improvement. Monks and nuns were especially devoted to cleanliness, though not for the reasons you might think. Bathing wasn't about vanity. It was about humility and discipline. Monastic rules often dictated how often a person could bathe. Too often was suspicious. Not enough was unhygienic. Once every 2 weeks was common, unless you were sick, or had been gardening, or perhaps developing a strong friendship with mildew. In some orders, bathwater was reused by rank, the abbot first, novices last. A system that was efficient, if not aromatic. Still, monasteries often had running water systems, bathhouses, and even heated rooms for washing. Far from the image of grimy ascetics, many medieval monks were cleaner than the average 18th century Londoner, which is an admittedly low bar, but still worth noting. Now, before you get too impressed, let's talk about laundry, because this is where things start to smell more authentic. Washing clothes was an ordeal. Water had to be hauled, heated, and mixed with soap or lye. Clothes were scrubbed by hand, beaten, and laid out to dry in the open air, which, in the middle of a city, was usually the same air that smelled faintly of animal fat and despair. Linen, the fabric worn closest to the body, was washed frequently. Wool garments, less so, and anything fur-lined, well, that was simply aired out and prayed over. The truly rich sometimes employed laundresses, women who specialized in keeping fine garments clean and scented. They used mixtures of lavender water, rose petals, and orris root powder. A nobleman's doublet might have smelled wonderful, assuming you could get close enough without being trampled by his entourage. And then there's the one smell that no one escaped: fire. Everything and everyone smelled faintly of smoke. It clung to hair, clothes, and skin. It was the background scent of life. Wood smoke from the hearth, from the forge, from the thousands of cooking fires that dotted every town and manor. If you were to walk through a medieval city, your nose would pick up layers of scent. Not just sewage and sweat, but wood smoke, beer, wet wool, tallow candles, horses, and bread. It would be dense, earthy, and strangely alive. Less filth and more complicated stew of humanity. So no, medieval people didn't smell good by our standards, but they didn't smell apocalyptic either. They smelled like what they lived among: herbs, leather, smoke, vinegar, and the occasional catastrophe. To a time traveler from today, it might be overwhelming, but to them it was simply home. Let's stop here and take a quiet breath, a moment to clear the mental air. In our next part, we'll drift deeper into the world of medieval medicine and the strange relationship between scent, sin, and health, because to the medieval mind, bad smells weren't just unpleasant. They were moral. A whiff of sulfur might signal not just rot, but the devil himself. So, rest easy, you're clean, you're modern, and, hopefully, you don't smell like medieval vinegar, at least not tonight. How did royal executioners actually live? The Headsman's Burden. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter, bloodier corner of history. A world where power meant life and death. And someone had to handle the death part. So, settle in, dim the lights. Maybe make sure your blanket's tucked just right, because tonight we're talking about the people nobody wanted to talk to. The royal executioners. They were necessary, but despised. Paid by the crown, yet barred from polite society. They kept the peace, mostly by ending it. And despite what movies might show, they weren't swaggering brutes in black hoods. They were accountants of mortality, tradesmen of terror, and occasionally, surprisingly, domestic. So let's begin where most of their days began, with work that nobody else wanted to do. Executioners occupied an odd social position, somewhere between essential and untouchable. Kings needed them, towns depended on them, but nobody wanted to sit next to them at dinner. In medieval Europe, their job description was simple: make death official. When justice needed to be seen, the executioner was called in to hang, behead, burn, or break. Depending on the mood of the court that day, it wasn't glamorous, but it was steady employment. The problem was that society had mixed feelings. Everyone believed their work was necessary, but also deeply polluting. Handling death was spiritually dangerous business. So, while the crown paid them, the church politely avoided them. Their neighbors kept their distance, and most people refused to shake their hand. That might sound petty, but this was a time when touching the wrong person was thought to stain your soul. So, imagine you're performing an essential civic duty, and the town baker still won't sell you bread unless you leave the coins on the step. The irony was, executioners often lived better than their neighbors. They were paid well, danger pay, in a sense, and they were granted privileges to compensate for their social exile. Free housing, exemptions from certain taxes, and sometimes unusual side businesses. Because, you see, when your day job involves chopping heads, people assume you know anatomy, which meant executioners often doubled as healers. Yes, really. The same man who might execute a thief in the morning could set a broken leg in the afternoon, or perform minor surgery, or extract a tooth. Apparently, if you could wield a sword with accuracy, people trusted you with a scalpel, and if that seems contradictory, well, the Middle Ages were full of those. In Germany especially, executioners were known for their medical skills. They had access to bodies, valuable for studying human anatomy, and they developed reputations as excellent herbalists. If you had an infected wound, you might quietly slip to the executioner's house after dark for a salve or a poultice. You just wouldn't mention it in church later. One of the most famous of these double-life headsmen was Franz Schmidt, the official executioner of Nuremberg in the late 1500s. And he's remarkable because he left behind a diary, which, as it turns out, is as close as we'll ever get to a medieval performance review. Franz was born into the profession. His father had been forced into it by a duke, literally told, "You're the executioner now," after witnessing a hanging. That was often how the job began. Nobody applied for it. It was assigned like jury duty, but permanent. Franz inherited his father's post, and over 45 years, he carried out 394 executions. He recorded every one of them. Method, name, and crime, in neat, measured handwriting. It reads almost like a prayer book, except every entry ends with someone's last breath. His tone is careful, even compassionate. He often wrote things like, "Executed Hans Vogel, who confessed with tears, and I prayed for his soul." He didn't seem to enjoy it, but he treated it as a solemn duty. And in between executions, he treated patients. He kept meticulous notes on remedies, injuries, and treatments. By retirement, he was more respected as a healer than as a headsman. In fact, the city of Nuremberg formally restored his family's honor, legally erasing the stain of executioner from his name, which, in bureaucratic terms, was the Renaissance equivalent of deleting your search history. But not every executioner was as tidy and reflective as Franz Schmidt. Most were a little rougher around the edges. Let's drift to France. There, executioners were known as bourreaux, and they became almost dynastic. The Sanson family, for example, served as royal executioners for 6 generations, spanning from the reign of Louis XIV to the French Revolution. That's roughly 150 years of beheading people professionally. It's hard to imagine what their family reunions were like. The most famous of them, Charles-Henri Sanson, executed over 2,900 people, including King Louis XVI himself, which is quite the resume, considering his family owed their entire position to the monarchy. Sanson's letters show a strange sense of pride and melancholy. He called his work a duty, not a pleasure, and he dressed with almost absurd precision. Powdered wig, fine coat, immaculate cuffs. He believed that dignity was owed to the condemned, and he saw himself as a kind of moral technician. Still, being an executioner was lonely work. The Sanson children often had trouble marrying outside the profession because, well, nobody wanted to marry into death. So, families like theirs just kept marrying other executioner families. It was the only social circle they had. A grim little gene pool, but a tight one. Let's linger on that for a moment. The hereditary nature of the job. Across much of Europe, executioners' children had few options. No one would hire them for normal work. They were considered unclean by association. So, the trade passed down from father to son. Sometimes the eldest would take the sword. Sometimes a brother would assist. In small towns, you'd even find executioner dynasties quietly spanning centuries. A name like Reindel or France appearing in the archives again and again, always with the same title beside it, Scharfrichter, German for sharp judge, which is both poetic and mildly terrifying. Of course, Every society had its own rules about how to handle its professional killers. In England, executioners were often part-time workers, drawn from the ranks of jailers or sergeants-at-arms. They weren't full-time specialists, which is probably why early English executions were variable in quality. There's the famous case of Mary, Queen of Scots. In 1587, she was executed by a man named Richard Shrewsbury, who was not particularly skilled. It took him 3 strikes to finish the job. On the first, he hit the back of her head. On the second, the neck. On the third, he had to pull the head free, only to have her wig come off, revealing that her hair had thinned and gone gray beneath the auburn dye. Not exactly the composed royal ending one imagines. Afterward, Shrewsbury held up the head and proclaimed the ritual phrase, "God save the Queen," which, given the circumstances, must have felt awkward. Executioners were often caught between ceremony and chaos. Royal beheadings, in particular, were theatrical. Crowds gathered, prayers were said, speeches made. The condemned were expected to show courage. The executioner was expected to show mercy. And both sides hoped for a clean stroke. If it wasn't clean, the audience would remember. Botched executions became local legends. One unlucky Englishman, Jack Ketch, became so notorious for messy work in the 1600s that his name became a synonym for hangman. Even centuries later, Victorian writers still used Jack Ketch as a shorthand for grim justice. Ketch was said to drink heavily. Though, in fairness, you might too, if your job required beheading your boss's political enemies before breakfast. There's a quieter, more domestic side to all of this, too. Executioners had homes, wives, children. They tended gardens, paid taxes, raised livestock. Their lives were surprisingly ordinary, if you ignored the occasional head in a basket. In some cities, they lived in designated houses on the edge of town, liminal spaces between the living and the dead. In Paris, for instance, the Sansons lived near the Place de Grève, where public executions took place. They could hear the crowds gathering from their windows. Neighbors avoided them, but people still came knocking, discreetly, when they needed help. A tooth pulled, a dislocated shoulder, or, in some cases, a vial of executioner's fat, a substance believed to have healing properties. Yes, rendered human fat, taken naturally from the executed. It was thought to cure rheumatism, swelling, and even epilepsy. People were appalled by executioners until they needed their ointment. The contradictions pile up like so much paperwork. Executioners were hated, but necessary. They symbolized justice, but carried shame. They were excluded from churches, yet paid by kings who styled themselves as God's anointed. It was an anti-satyri, existence both privileged and polluted, a sort of moral quarantine. Imagine living your entire life knowing that your neighbors think you're cursed, but your ruler thinks you're indispensable. That tension between disgust and dependence defined the profession. And yet, some found dignity in it. Franz Schmidt signed his records with a steady hand, noting not only his executions, but his prayers for each soul. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as an agent of order, a man cleaning up the world's moral messes, one stroke at a time. When he died, his tombstone described him not as an executioner, but as Master Franz Schmidt, citizen and doctor of medicine. The title he'd always wanted, the title society had finally allowed him to keep. Why did so many monks write about demons at night? The candlelight hours. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter age. The kind of quiet that hums just before you start hearing things. It's the Middle Ages. The monasteries are sleeping. The wind slides through stone cloisters, and somewhere, in a narrow scriptorium lit by one trembling candle, a monk dips his quill in ink and sighs. He's been awake for hours, copying yet another sermon or psalm, his fingers stiff, his back aching. The candle hisses softly. The air smells of parchment and wax, and then, just at the edge of hearing, a rustle, a whisper, something moving in the dark. He looks up. Nothing. But later, when he writes in his journal, he'll mention it, quietly, as if confessing, "The devil troubled me again tonight." That's the strange thing about medieval monastic writing. It's full of demons, not metaphorical ones either. Real, physical demons, scratching, whispering, breathing down the necks of holy men who were just trying to finish a paragraph. You'll find them everywhere. In monastic texts, tiny devils tugging at the robes of scribes in the margins of manuscripts. Lucifer, himself appearing in a monk's dream to complain about being too often described, and endless, weary notes about temptation, lust, gluttony, boredom, doubt, always worst after midnight. But why? Why did so many monks, in their cold stone sanctuaries, end up convinced that the shadows around them were full of demons? That's what we'll explore tonight. We'll wander through the dim corridors of medieval monasteries, through the insomnia, the isolation, and the sheer strangeness of the human mind when it's left too long alone with itself. Because the truth is, these demons tell us as much about people as about theology. They weren't just nightmares. They were symptoms of exhaustion, repression, fear, and occasionally bad cheese. Let's start by picturing the setting. It's easy to romanticize medieval monasteries, all that peaceful, chanting and illuminated manuscripts. But they were not cozy places. A typical monk in, say, the 12th century lived under strict routine. He woke before dawn for prayers, ate plain food, slept in a communal dormitory, and spoke as little as possible. The walls were thick, the rooms cold. The light came from candles or narrow windows that barely noticed the sun. And when night came, it was dark. Not city dark or rural dark, but a darkness so complete that the stars looked like holes punched through heaven. In that kind of dark, Even silence has a sound. Now imagine you've been fasting all day. You've barely slept. You're supposed to be copying a manuscript by lamplight, while trying not to think impure thoughts. Your mind drifts. You start to see things move in the corner of your eye. The candle flame quivers. The wax smells faintly sweet. You hear scratching. Mice, probably. Or maybe something else. Welcome to the average evening in a medieval monastery. Monks believed the night belonged to demons. Daylight was God's time. Orderly, rational, filled with work and prayer. But darkness was when the devil wandered. That's when the nocturnal temptations struck. Lust, despair, hunger, fatigue. Theologians even gave the experience a name, acedia, the noonday demon. It didn't necessarily arrive at noon, despite the name. It was the creeping melancholy that made monks stare blankly at their walls and wonder what on earth they were doing with their lives. Today we'd probably call it depression or burnout. Back then, it was a spiritual attack. One monk described acedia as the demon that makes the sun seem to stand still. Another wrote that it caused him to yawn endlessly. A spiritual symptom, apparently, though possibly also boredom. The cure? Prayer. Work. More fasting. You know, all the things that caused the problem in the first place. But while acedia was the slow, sinking demon of the day, the night brought a livelier crowd. Demons were thought to gather around monks who prayed alone after dark, tapping their shoulders, whispering doubts, and, in some cases, appearing in forms that were frankly rude. Saint Anthony the Great, one of the desert hermits of early Christianity, was supposedly beaten up by demons while praying in a cave. They appeared as wild beasts and women, because of course they did, and left him bruised but spiritually victorious. This story became wildly popular in medieval art. Painters loved to depict St. Anthony surrounded by grotesque little monsters biting his toes and tugging his beard. It's easy to laugh, but these weren't jokes to the monks who copied those images. For them, the battle against demons was literal. Every creak in the night, every shadow across the page could be part of that war. There's also a very practical reason monks saw things. They lived on the edge of physical endurance. A medieval monastic diet was minimalist, lots of vegetables, bread, and thin beer. Meat was banned in many orders. Combine that with fasting, sleep deprivation, and long hours of isolation, and you have a recipe for hallucination. Add in a flickering candle flame, and suddenly the patterns of soot on the wall look like faces. The mind, deprived of stimulation, starts to invent company. And then there's the guilt. Medieval theology didn't make much room for emotional ambiguity. If you were sad, lonely, or tempted, that wasn't just being human. That was sin creeping in. So every thought, every desire had to be catalogued, confessed, fought. Imagine trying to suppress every passing impulse. and then spending 8 hours a day alone in the dark with your imagination. The human brain doesn't like that. It rebels. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it invents something to whisper back. One of my favorite examples of this comes from a 12th century monk named Herbert of Clairvaux, who wrote that the devil tempted him so persistently during prayer that he finally threw his inkpot at him. We don't know whether Herbert actually saw anything, but we do know he ruined a perfectly good manuscript in the process. There's also the case of Brother Recalmus, a Cistercian monk from the 13th century, who kept a detailed diary of his demonic encounters. He claimed the air around him was full of invisible spirits, tiny ones, fluttering like gnats, constantly buzzing and distracting him. He said they perched on his shoulders, whispered in his ears, and even tried to interfere when he went to the latrine. Yes, apparently even monks weren't safe there. But Recalmus also wrote with an odd sense of routine, as if the demons were just part of daily life. Like flies you can't quite swat away. He once remarked, with weary understatement, "They are many, but I am used to them." It's almost comforting. In a way, he'd made peace with his hallucinations. Of course, not all demons were personal. Some were institutional. Monasteries were full of tension, petty rivalries, leadership disputes, people arguing about how many beans constituted gluttony. When something went wrong, a fire, an illness, a missing loaf of bread, it was convenient to blame the devil. Demons were the ultimate HR solution. They explained everything: laziness, lust, heresy, indigestion, and unlike human culprits, they couldn't sue for defamation. We also have to remember that night was longer then. Before artificial light, humans lived by the rhythm of two sleeps. The first sleep after dusk, and the second sleep in the early morning. Between them was a stretch of wakefulness, an hour or two when people got up, prayed, wrote, or quietly panicked about existence. For monks, this in-between time was when the mind was most porous, half dreaming, half awake, and in that half-dream, demons crept in. But while monks feared demons, they also needed them. They gave shape to temptation. They made loneliness meaningful. Without demons, the daily grind of monastic life might have seemed merely pointless. With them, it became a cosmic battle, a struggle between good and evil, fought over the mundane details of bread, sleep, and chastity. A flickering candle became a weapon of faith. A yawn became a moral failing. And a squeaking mouse became Satan. Art from the period captures this beautifully. Those manuscript margins filled with little red devils, grimacing faces and strange hybrids of cats, snails, and humans. To modern eyes, they look whimsical. But to the monks who drew them, they were both warning and comfort. Drawing a demon gave it boundaries. It put fear onto parchment, where it could be safely examined, even mocked. It's not so different from us. Really, we make memes about our anxieties. They made miniatures. So, what did all this demon talk accomplish? Well, on one hand, it kept monks vigilant, maybe too much so. They wrote endless treatises about temptation, about the dangers of daydreaming, about how to properly despise one's own flesh. On the other hand, it produced some of the most hauntingly beautiful art and writing of the Middle Ages. Out of their fear came the luminous manuscripts, the delicate calligraphy, the illuminated devils and saints, each page a fragile truce between devotion and delirium. Let's drift forward now, deeper into the candlelight, and meet some of these monks face to face. In the next part, we'll wander through the lives of the men who actually claim to see their demons, the visionaries, the chroniclers, the insomniacs, from the deserts of Egypt to the cloisters of France. And we'll ask whether they were haunted by hell, or just by themselves. Who were the women who passed as men to join armies? The quiet rebellion of disguise. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a quieter corner of history. The kind that doesn't make it into grand military chronicles or royal genealogies. The kind that lived in the shadows, or, more precisely, in trousers. Because tonight, we're talking about the women who disguised themselves as men to join armies. They cut their hair, bound their chests, lowered their voices, and marched off to war under borrowed names. They slept in barracks, fought in battles, and sometimes even died before anyone realized who they were. It's a strange, moving little corner of human history, equal parts tragic, brave, and absurd. And while it's easy to romanticize the plucky girl soldier sneaking off to glory, the truth is far more complicated and far more human. So, settle in. Let the lights dim, the noise fade, and let's drift back to a world where gender wasn't just identity. It was survival. Let's start with something simple. The reason why women did this. It wasn't usually for glory. It was for food, or money, or love, or occasionally, for the sheer stubborn desire to do something they were told they couldn't. In most of medieval and early modern Europe, women were legally barred from military service. They couldn't inherit fiefs that required martial duty. They couldn't enlist as soldiers, and they couldn't officially hold rank, which, naturally, meant that some of them did all of those things anyway, because the human impulse to break rules for necessity or for curiosity is far older than feminism. One of the earliest known cases dates back to the 14th century. Jeanne de Clisson, a Breton noblewoman who, after her husband was executed by the French crown, decided to launch a private war in revenge. She sold her lands, bought a fleet of ships, and began raiding French vessels in the English Channel. Her crew called her the Lioness of Brittany. Now, Jeanne didn't exactly pretend to be a man. Her reputation was too public for that. But she did command men as one, and she wore armor, carried a sword, and fought like someone with very unresolved marital grief. In other words, she set a precedent, a woman putting on the trappings of male violence, and doing it disturbingly well. But not all disguised soldiers were noblewomen turned pirates. Most were from the lower classes. women who needed the steady pay and rations of army life. For them, passing as a man wasn't rebellion, it was employment. And so we meet Hannah Snell, an 18th-century Englishwoman who joined the British Marines under the name James Gray. Her story sounds like something out of a slightly tipsy stage play, but it's well documented. Hannah's husband had abandoned her, and she needed income. So she borrowed a suit of clothes from her brother-in-law and enlisted. She served for years, fought in India, and even survived being shot in the groin, which, given her secret, must have been an exceptionally stressful medical situation. When she finally returned to England, she revealed her identity publicly. And instead of being punished, she became famous. Crowds came to hear her speak. Pamphlets were written about her, and she performed in uniform on stage, because 18th-century London adored a spectacle, especially one that involved both scandal and patriotism. For a while, she was even granted a small pension for her service. It was a rare, almost happy ending. Most women who did what she did were not so lucky. Let's drift back a bit earlier, to the 17th century, and to Catalina de Erauso, also known as La Monja Alferez. The Lieutenant Nun Catalina was born in Spain in 1592, raised in a convent, and, according to her memoirs, fled it by stealing a set of clothes from her brother and cutting her hair. What followed was decades of wandering through the Spanish colonies under various male aliases. She fought as a soldier in Chile, killed several men in duels, and developed what historians might generously describe as a complicated moral record. At one point, she even confessed her gender to a bishop who, unsure of what to do, wrote to the Pope. The Pope, in turn, was reportedly so amused by her story that he granted her permission to continue dressing as a man for the rest of her life. It's one of the few times in recorded history that the Vatican essentially said, "You know what? Sure, keep the trousers." Catalina became a celebrity when she returned to Spain, dictating her memoirs and performing her life story for fascinated audiences. She wasn't exactly a hero, but she was living proof that gender was sometimes more costume than constraint. Now, most of these stories, the ones we know, anyway, come from the handful of women who were discovered. But historians suspect there were far more who never were. Because, really, how would anyone have known? If a soldier kept quiet, bathed rarely, and didn't draw attention, their secret could stay safe for years. Uniforms were baggy, army camps were chaotic, and medicine was not intrusive. A woman could live, fight, and die as a man, and history would record her under whatever name she chose. Many did. Their graves are anonymous, their stories lost somewhere between rumor and paperwork. But when we do find traces of them, they're almost always strange, sad, and strangely practical. Take Deborah Sampson, a Massachusetts woman who disguised herself as a man to fight in the American Revolutionary War. She enlisted under the name Robert Shirtliff, served for over a year, and was only discovered after falling ill with fever. though she had previously removed a musket ball from her own thigh to keep her secret. A terrifying level of commitment, though perhaps not one any of us should emulate. After her identity was revealed, she was quietly discharged, and later she petitioned Congress for a pension, which she eventually received. Her husband applied for a widow's pension after her death, which feels like a fittingly bureaucratic twist to a very unbureaucratic life. What's striking in all these cases is how unromantic most of them really were. There were no cinematic moments of revelation, no triumphant marches home. Just tired, resourceful women navigating a world with very few options, and sometimes finding strange freedom in the chaos of war. For a peasant woman, enlisting meant food, clothing, and a wage. For a noble woman, it could mean escape from marriage, from scandal, from expectation, and for others, like Catalina or Hannah, it might have been something deeper. A way of living as themselves, in a world that didn't have words for what they were. And that's part of the quiet beauty of these stories. They're not about war, or victory, or even gender. They're about movement. Women stepping out of the rigid stillness of their social roles, even if just for a little while, and walking or marching into a world that had always told them no. The irony, of course, is that many of them did it better than the men around them. There are military records praising young soldiers for bravery, discipline, and discretion, only to later discover that the praised soldier had been a woman all along. One commander even noted, somewhat bewildered, that his best recruit never swore, drank, or visited women. That would have been his first clue. Really? But as centuries passed and armies became more organized, it became harder to hide. Uniforms got stricter, camps more regimented, and medical inspections more common. By the 19th century, disguising oneself successfully was almost impossible, though a few still tried. During the American Civil War, historians estimate that hundreds of women fought disguised as men on both sides. Not dozens, hundreds. Letters, diaries, and pension claims hint at a shadow army that fought, marched, and bled beside their male comrades, often unnoticed. One Confederate soldier later wrote, "We thought him a quiet boy. Turns out he was a very quiet girl," which feels like the entire theme of this story. Really? So yes, they existed. Not in fantasy, but in record books and graveyards and whispered memories. Women who wore men's clothes, not for fashion or rebellion, but because it was the only way to move freely through the world. And though history has a habit of losing their names, every so often one drifts back up from an old muster roll, or a court record, or a pension file, and reminds us that the past wasn't as simple as we like to pretend. And almost all of them died without descendants, which, of course, was the entire point. The system had been designed so that none of them could pass on their bloodline. And in the end, it worked perfectly. Their names simply stopped. Let's pause here. Take a quiet breath. In the next part, we'll drift further into this hidden history, tracing how societies reacted when these disguises were discovered, how courts punished them, how ballads celebrated them, and how, centuries later, their stories were rewritten into legend. Because when history finally remembered them, it often did so with the kind of irony only time can provide. The women who were punished for pretending to be men became, in the end, the most celebrated women of their age. Let's pause there for a moment and breathe, because in our next part, we'll drift deeper into the social exile of these men and their families. How entire bloodlines lived on the fringes of Christian Europe. Running taverns, marrying each other, and slowly carving out strange, independent worlds of their own. For now, picture a quiet dawn in Nuremberg. The square is empty. A man in a dark doublet stands by a wooden scaffold, his sword gleaming in the frost. He bows his head, mutters a prayer, and begins another day's work. What did medieval people actually smell like? The fragrance of filth tonight? We're drifting back to a world before soap smelled like mountain breeze or ocean mist. Back to a time when the average bath was more of a rumor than a routine, and perfume was often less about personal scent and more about chemical warfare against reality. So, get comfortable, because we're going to spend the next while wandering through the sensory fog of the Middle Ages, a place where everything and everyone smelled like something, and it wasn't always bad, just different. Different enough that if you could travel back in time, your first words probably wouldn't be, "Wow, nights." They'd be something more like, "Oh no." When people picture medieval Europe, they often imagine dirt. Endless, unavoidable dirt. And to be fair, there was a lot of it. Cities were cramped and unpaved, animals wandered freely through the streets, and waste disposal was, let's say, an ongoing project. But that doesn't mean everyone was waddling through filth 24/7. In reality, medieval people cared quite a lot about cleanliness. They just had a very different understanding of what that meant. To us, clean usually means germ-free. To them, it meant something more like balanced in body and spirit. They didn't know about bacteria, but they believed in miasma, the idea that bad air carried disease. And so, much of medieval hygiene was about keeping away bad smells, because bad smells were thought to be sickness. If you inhaled too much of a foul odor, it could supposedly corrupt your humors, the bodily fluids that were believed to control everything from health to mood to, occasionally, the urge to lecture people about sin. So, yes, smell mattered, but maybe not in the way you're expecting. Let's start with the cities. London, Paris, Florence, Cologne, all beautiful today. But in the 13th century, each was a fragrance experiment gone wrong. Take London. For instance, by 1300, the city had over 80,000 people crammed inside its walls, all generating the usual human byproducts. Most of that waste went into cesspits, brick-lined holes in the ground that, in theory, were emptied regularly. In theory. In practice, they often overflowed. sometimes into the street, sometimes into a neighbor's cellar. There's a recorded case from 1326 where a man in York literally fell through his latrine floor and drowned in it. The coroner wrote it up as an unfortunate accident, which technically it was, and yet people didn't simply shrug and accept the stench. They fought it as best they could. Cities hired gong farmers, yes, that was the actual title, to clean out cesspits under cover of night. They wore thick leather boots, carried long shovels, and worked by lantern light. It was one of the few medieval jobs where you could earn good money, presumably because no one wanted to stand near you ever again. Now, it's easy to imagine that medieval people were oblivious to their surroundings. But they weren't. They noticed the smell of tanneries. For example, the workshops where animal hides were softened with urine and lime. They noticed the stench of butchers' markets, where blood mixed with rainwater in the gutters. They noticed everything. They just had different thresholds. To them, the real horrors were not manure or sweat. Those were normal. It was the rotting smells that frightened them. Stagnant water, spoiled meat, corpses left too long before burial. Those, they believed, carried death. So cities had laws about them. London banned butchers from working near certain neighborhoods. Paris required tanners to set up shop downstream. Florence had inspectors who fined people for dumping waste into the Arno River, which they all did anyway. Cleanliness, in the medieval sense, was mostly about managing decay, keeping the world from tipping too far into chaos. But not everything smelled like misery. If you followed your nose toward the wealthier parts of town, near the cathedrals, the manors, the monasteries, the air would start to change. Wealthy people could afford herbs and perfumes. Lavender, rosemary, thyme. Not just for cooking, but for scattering on floors and burning in braziers. It was believed that pleasant scents purified the air. A house that smelled of flowers was, quite literally, safer. In churches, the same logic held. The air was thick with incense, frankincense, and myrrh, rising in slow curls toward the vaulted ceilings. It wasn't just for show. Incense, they believed, kept demons and diseases at bay. Medieval life was a constant negotiation between the sacred and the septic. Now, you might be wondering, what about people themselves? How did they smell? Well, that depended on who you were and how much water you had access to. Contrary to the everyone was filthy myth, bathing was actually pretty common in the Middle Ages. Public bathhouses were everywhere, not just in cities, but in small towns too. They were a social affair. People went to bathe, to gossip, to eat, to occasionally do things that would make a modern spa lose its license. In fact, some bathhouses became so associated with scandal that reformers began shutting them down. Still, for centuries, they were an accepted part of life. The water was often heated by wood fires, sometimes perfumed with herbs or petals. You'd sit in a wooden tub, rinse off, maybe have a drink, and leave feeling, if not sterile, at least renewed. So when did medieval people stop bathing? Ironically, when they started worrying about being too clean. By the late Middle Ages, physicians began to suspect that hot water opened the pores and let in disease. This belief really took off during the Renaissance and the early modern period, especially after plague outbreaks. People stopped bathing as often and started covering themselves in perfumes instead. If you were French nobility in the 17th century, you might take one bath a year, but you'd change your linen daily and drown yourself in floral water. So, yes, ironically, medieval people bathed more often than some of their more refined descendants. Let's talk about what those people actually smelled like. Though, skin, hair, clothes, everything. Because if you stood in a medieval crowd, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't necessarily be filth. It would be layers of smells. Wool and leather. Wood smoke from hearths. Sweat, yes, but mingled with herbs like sage or mint rubbed on the skin. Oils from lamps. A faint sweetness from mead or ale, and, always, a background note of animals, because animals were everywhere, even inside. A noblewoman's gown might smell faintly of lavender sachets, but her shoes probably reeked of wet leather and horse dung. A knight's armor might be polished to a shine, but the padding underneath, less so, and peasants, they smelled like earth, like hay and grain, and whatever animal they worked with most closely. There's a kind of rough dignity in that, to smell like your livelihood. But the smellscape of the Middle Ages wasn't just about people or cities. It was also about seasons. Spring brought the scent of wet soil and blossoms. Summer was ripe with hay and sweat. Autumn was smoke and fermenting apples. Winter was damp, wool and candle wax. For most medieval people, smell was as much a marker of time as any clock tower. They lived by it, measured their work by it, and occasionally blamed it for their misfortunes. If a field smelled wrong, it was cursed. If the wind from the east carried an unfamiliar scent, it might mean plague. If a saint's body gave off a pleasant fragrance after death, it was proof of holiness. The so-called odor of sanctity, which, yes, is an actual theological term because nothing says divine miracle like a corpse that smells like roses. It's also worth remembering that medieval medicine was heavily scent-based. Doctors prescribed smelling things almost as often as drinking them. If you were ill, you might be told to sniff vinegar or hold a bundle of herbs to your nose. During plague years, people carried pomanders, little metal balls filled with perfume or spices, to ward off the bad air. A well-dressed gentleman in 14th century Florence might walk around with a tiny silver orb dangling from his belt, filled with rosemary, clove, and ambergris. It was fashionable and medicinal, the medieval equivalent of wearing hand sanitizer as jewelry. Of course, there were still plenty of genuinely bad smells that no one could romanticize. Rotting fish by the river, stagnant water in moats, chamber pots emptied from second-story windows, Aditi, surprisingly common method of waste disposal, usually announced by the polite shout of "Gardiloo" before impact. If you lived below street level, you might experience the medieval version of a drive-by. And if you were unlucky enough to live downwind of a tannery or butcher's yard, well, congratulations, you were part of the urban experience. It wasn't pleasant, but it was normal. And yet, amid all of this, there was a strange beauty. Because smell, for medieval people, was connection to God, to the earth, to one another. Priests anointed kings with oils that smelled of frankincense and myrrh. Brides were crowned with garlands of herbs to keep them pure. Monks grew gardens not just for food, but for scent. Lavender, sage, chamomile. Even in the poorest huts, people scattered mint or thyme on their floors to sweeten the air. They may not have had deodorant, but they had dignity. So, no, medieval people didn't all smell like death and dung. They smelled like life, in all its messy, fragrant forms, like wood smoke and honey, like sweat and iron, like bread just pulled from the oven. If you walked through a medieval town, your nose would be overwhelmed, yes, but not necessarily offended, a scent not of filth, but of humanity.